Gunnar's Daughter, Chapter 14. When spring came, Vigdis said that this summer she would live at the Seder with Asha, and so it was agreed, though Gunnar was against it. But Asha at length talked him over. They then left for the forest very early in the season, taking with them a man whose name was Skofte. He was Asha's son and a freedman of Gunnar. He was to tend the horses and guard the cattle from wild beasts. One day, towards evening, Asha stood at the door of the byre, letting in the cows, when Vigdis came up to her in great distress and said, "Here is Gunnar, coming up the hillside. I know not what will happen. He will surely kill me when he sees how I am now." "Go to your bed," replied Asha. "I will tell him you are sick. He will not stay long." Vigdis did so, and kept her bed the 2 days Gunnar was there. He said it was not to be wondered at that she had fallen sick, or that they were short of milk, seeing how early they had gone to the hills, while the nights were still frosty, and there was little pasture in the woods. But after this, Asha made up her mind that she ought to speak to Vigdis and give her some advice. So she said one day, as the others stood at the bench scouring milk pails, "Let me do that. You must not work so hard now." Vigdis flung her pail to the ground, and her eyes were so wild that they frightened her foster mother. She screamed aloud, "Not a word of that to me, or I know not what I may do to you." After that, Asha never dared to speak of the matter to Vigdis, and now summer was wearing on. One night, Vigdis got up and left the Seder. It was past midsummer, and the weather was calm and cloudy. She walked some way over the paddock. When she came to the fence, she could do no more, but had to lie down and wait a while. A dun horse was grazing at the edge of the woods. She did not keep with the rest, but stayed near the houses. He was much petted and specially fond of Vigdis. He came now and sniffed at her, stood over her as she lay there. When the pains abated a little, she stood up and walked along the cattle track. The horse followed her the whole time. Each time the pains came on, she threw her arms about his neck and leaned against him. And then he turned his head, nibbled at her shoulder and back, and stood quite still. At last she reached a large dark sheet of water. High up there was a break in the clouds, reflected in the tarn. All else was black and dismal. Once she shrieked loudly, but the echo from the crag on the other side of the lake was so horrible that she was afraid of being heard, and stuffed a corner of her cloak into her mouth. She bit it into little pieces, filling her mouth with shreds of wool, and thought they must choke her. She heard a running brook close at hand, and once, on opening her eyes, she saw that dawn was breaking. Little black wavelets ruffled the tarn, but she could not crawl down to it, and the time wore on miserably for her. The sun came up and began to hurt her eyes. Not long after, Vigdis was delivered. Then she lay for a long time in a swoon, but at last she felt the sun warming her, and she heard the child scream. She looked at it. It was a boy. She shrank from touching it, but took a kerchief she had worn over her head and shoulders. It was white with green stripes, damp with sweat and dew and stained with blood. She folded it about the child, pushed it in between 2 stones, and spread moss and twigs over it. Then she made her way to the brook and drank. There was a great bare rock by the side of the water. The sun had warmed it, and Vigdis leaned her back against it, resting there a while. Then she got up and dragged herself home to the Seder. There she found Asha in great distress. Skofte had gone out to search for her. Vigdis went in and lay down on her bed. She had fever and was very sick for some days. Asha took care of her and rubbed her breasts with warm butter, but neither of them spoke of what had happened. Vigdis would never again go out into the forest, but stayed within doors. Asha could see no sign that she was less sorrowful than before.